Alpha King meant to claim sister. Alpha King ignored her and claimed Omega instead. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Ethan Blackwood stood at the edge of the high balcony of his castle, the wind whipping through his dark, messy hair. His eyes, the same piercing green as his father's, gazed out over the kingdom he was destined to rule. As the Alpha King, his life had always been laid out for him. His path was clear: marry his sister, Olivia, just as tradition dictated. It had always been the plan, since the very moment he was born. Olivia, his older sister, had been the one to raise him after their parents passed. She was more than family. She was his protector, his confidant, and, most importantly, the one he was supposed to marry when the time came. The weight of that knowledge had never been lost on him. But there was something different, a feeling he couldn't ignore. It began when he first met Isabella Hawke, an Omega from the farthest reaches of his kingdom. At first, it was just a passing curiosity. He'd heard of the mysterious Omegas before, but he had never met one in person. When Isabella stepped into the royal hall, with her delicate features and that unexplainable pull he felt the moment their eyes met, everything changed. He had thought it was just a fleeting attraction, a simple infatuation. But no, it was deeper than that. The connection he felt was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He couldn't deny the pull. Every time they spoke, every glance shared, it felt like he was falling further into a world he didn't know existed. The more he tried to resist, the more the bond between them grew. And that's when it happened. The choice he was never prepared for. Ethan found himself standing in the middle of his grand hall, torn between two women. On one side, Olivia, his sister, the one he was meant to marry. On the other, Isabella, his Omega, the one who stirred something inside him that he couldn't fight, no matter how much he wanted to. His heart was torn in two, and the weight of his duty pressed on his shoulders. The entire kingdom was watching, waiting for him to choose. Olivia stood there, eyes filled with hurt and confusion, as if she could already feel the decision brewing in her brother's heart. Ethan's gaze shifted to Isabella, who stood quietly, her eyes full of understanding but also a quiet desperation. He knew the consequences of his decision. Choosing Olivia would fulfill his duty, his kingdom's expectations, but choosing Isabella, that would change everything. It wasn't just a decision between two women. It was a decision that would shape the future of his kingdom, his family, and his own soul. And no matter what he chose, it would never be the same again. The silence in the grand hall was deafening as Ethan stood in the middle of the room, his mind racing. His father's voice echoed in his head, reminding him of the tradition, the responsibility that came with being the Alpha King. "You must marry your sister, Olivia," his father had said countless times. "It is the way of our people. It is your duty to carry on the legacy." Ethan had always accepted that. He had always thought he could carry out his role without question. But standing here, in the presence of both Olivia and Isabella, everything felt wrong. Olivia, his older sister, stood before him, her expression a mixture of sadness and determination. She had known this day would come, just as Ethan had. They had been raised together, and their bond ran deep. But the bond of family was not the only thing that tied them together. Their kingdom relied on their union. The people expected it. Yet, even as she looked at him with eyes full of understanding, Ethan could see the hurt in her gaze. She had always been the one for him. But things had changed. Isabella had changed everything. The Omega stood a little to the side, her quiet presence almost ethereal in the dim light. Her soft brown eyes were focused on Ethan, but there was no desperation in her expression, just acceptance. She had known from the moment they met that this wouldn't be easy. She had known that as much as they were drawn to one another, the world around them would never allow for their love. But the pull was undeniable. Ethan could feel it in every breath he took. There was a deep, almost magnetic connection between them, something that he had never experienced before. It was more than just attraction. It was something older, something deeper, something that felt like destiny. "Ethan," Olivia spoke softly, her voice breaking through his thoughts. "You don't have to choose. I know what is expected of us. But if your heart belongs to her, then go to her. I'll understand." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of her sacrifice. Ethan turned to her, his heart breaking. Olivia was the last person he ever wanted to hurt. She had always been there for him, guiding him, loving him. She had never once questioned the future that had been laid out for them. And yet, here they were, at a crossroads, a choice that would change everything. He could see it in her eyes. She was giving him permission. She was giving him freedom, even if it meant losing him forever. His eyes flickered back to Isabella. The Omega stood there, silent, waiting. She had never asked for this. She had never expected to be in the position she was in now. But here she was, standing before him, willing to accept whatever decision he made. Ethan felt a pang in his chest. How could he choose between the two of them? Both were integral to his life, and yet, neither could truly coexist in the way he had been taught to believe. He had to choose. He knew it, and the weight of it threatened to crush him. "Olivia," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to do." Olivia stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Follow your heart," she said softly. "I'll always be here. You're not losing me. You're just finding your own path." Ethan nodded, unable to speak. The decision was clear, yet the pain of it cut deep. With one last glance at his sister, he turned to face Isabella. "I choose you," he said, his voice steady but full of uncertainty. Isabella's eyes widened, and for a moment, there was a flicker of emotion in her gaze, surprise, relief, and something else. But she said nothing. She didn't need to. The bond between them was enough. Ethan knew that choosing Isabella would bring challenges. It would bring conflict, not only from those who didn't understand, but from those who had expectations. But in his heart, he knew it was the right choice. He could no longer deny the connection they shared. And no matter the cost, he was willing to fight for it. The days following Ethan's decision were filled with tension and uncertainty. His choice to claim Isabella instead of Olivia had set the kingdom abuzz. Whispers spread like wildfire through the castle corridors, and even the streets of the kingdom were alive with rumors. Some praised the Alpha King's decision, claiming that love could not be bound by duty. Others, however, were less understanding. The nobles, who had long expected the union between Ethan and Olivia, were the loudest in their protests. "It is a betrayal of tradition," they said. "A betrayal of the kingdom." Ethan, however, felt an undeniable peace in his heart, despite the chaos that surrounded him. Every time he looked at Isabella, he knew he had made the right choice. Her presence brought a calmness he had never felt before. The Omega, with her quiet strength and soft demeanor, was everything he needed in a partner. She didn't demand the world from him. She didn't expect him to be perfect. She simply accepted him for who he was. But that acceptance came at a price. The pressure from the kingdom weighed heavily on Ethan's shoulders. He had always known his role as Alpha King, but now, more than ever, he could feel the eyes of the people on him, judging every step he took. Olivia, too, was struggling. She had smiled when he made his choice, but Ethan could see the sadness in her eyes every time their paths crossed. She had always been the one to support him, to guide him, and now she was forced to accept his decision, even though it had broken something inside her. But Olivia was not the only one struggling. Isabella, too, was feeling the weight of the consequences. Though she had been willing to accept whatever came with being with Ethan, the reality of their situation was more difficult than she had imagined. She was no longer just an Omega in the eyes of the court. She was now a target both of admiration and disdain. The court's eyes were sharp, and they were watching her every move. They didn't understand her, and most didn't want to. They had been raised to believe that Omegas were to be ruled over, not to rule beside an Alpha King. Isabella had known the world would never accept her as Ethan's equal, but the reality of that truth was beginning to settle in. As the weeks passed, Ethan and Isabella grew closer, their bond strengthening with each passing day. They spent long hours together, speaking of everything and nothing, of their hopes, their fears, and the future they wanted to build. Ethan shared his struggles as the Alpha King, the weight of his crown often feeling unbearable. Isabella, in turn, opened up about her life as an Omega, the challenges she faced in a world that saw her as lesser. Together, they found solace in one another, a place where they could both just be. But despite their growing connection, the world around them was not so forgiving. Olivia, though she never spoke of it, withdrew further from Ethan. She kept to herself, never pushing him away, but never fully welcoming him either. The kingdom watched closely, waiting for the inevitable fallout of the Alpha King's choice. Ethan could feel the tension mounting with each passing day. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but he also knew he had to do whatever it took to protect the future he was trying to build with Isabella. He was no longer the young prince who had followed tradition without question. He was the Alpha King who had made a choice that would forever alter the course of his life and the kingdom's. And no matter what, he would stand by it. The following months were filled with quiet tension and unspoken words. Ethan had made his choice, and though the initial shock of his decision was beginning to fade, the repercussions were still very much alive. Isabella, the woman he had chosen, was still a mystery to many in the kingdom. Some looked at her with admiration, for she was with the Alpha King, a position of power and prestige that no Omega had ever held before. But others, especially the old nobles, were quick to judge. They whispered behind closed doors, questioning whether an Omega, especially one as unknown as Isabella, could truly stand by. Ethan sighed. The pressure on both of them was immense, and Ethan felt it more than ever. Every decision, every word he spoke, was scrutinized. He could no longer be the carefree prince he had once been. Now, every step he took had to be measured, calculated. He was Alpha King, and his every action had the potential to change the course of history. Isabella, too, felt the weight of it all. She had never asked for this life, never wanted to be at the center of a kingdom's turmoil. She had known the harsh realities of being an Omega, the limitations that came with it. But standing beside Ethan, she felt both a sense of pride and an overwhelming sense of fear. Fear of failing him, of not being able to live up to the expectations placed upon her. Ethan's love for her was unwavering, and she knew that. But in the world they lived in, love alone could not protect them from the challenges ahead. Their relationship, though deep and genuine, was not without its difficulties. Every day brought new obstacles, new challenges that tested their bond. The court was constantly a reminder of the world they lived in, where expectations were set in stone, and breaking tradition was seen as a crime. Olivia, too, was struggling in her own way. Ethan had made his choice, and she had accepted it. But acceptance did not mean that the pain had disappeared. The bond between siblings was strong, and though she never expressed it openly, Ethan could feel her distance. She had once been the one who guided him, who loved him unconditionally. Now, though, she kept her distance, and the silence between them grew louder with each passing day. Olivia, ever the composed woman, rarely let her emotions show. But Ethan could see the hurt in her eyes when their paths crossed, the way her gaze lingered on him just a little longer than it used to. He wanted to reach out to her, to fix things, but he knew that the damage had been done. The choice had been made, and no matter how much he wished things could be different, he knew they never would be again. As time passed, the kingdom began to adjust to the new reality. Ethan and Isabella, though still under constant scrutiny, found moments of peace together. They walked the halls of the castle side by side, shared meals in the private chambers, and spoke of their hopes and dreams for a future that seemed impossible just months ago. Despite the world around them, they found solace in each other's company. Ethan had made his decision, and now he had to live with it. No matter the challenges that came their way, he would stand by Isabella. Together, they would face the trials of being an Alpha King and his Omega, no matter what the world thought. The weight of the decision that Ethan had made began to settle even deeper in the days that followed. Despite the closeness he shared with Isabella, the kingdom was still not ready to accept them. The whispers continued, some louder than others, and those who held power within the court were still unsure of what the future held. Yet, amid the tensions and doubts, Ethan remained resolute. He had chosen his path, and he would not falter. Each day brought new challenges. The pressure of ruling weighed heavily on him, but the challenges of his personal life seemed to complicate matters further. The expectations placed on him as Alpha King were relentless, and with Isabella by his side, he found it more difficult to maintain the balance between duty and desire. The court had grown accustomed to his usual approach, which was one of formality and distance. But with Isabella, he could no longer pretend. There were moments when their eyes met across the room, and it felt as though time stood still. Their connection, though still controversial, was undeniable. Isabella had never asked for the attention or the life that had been thrust upon her. She had lived a quiet existence before Ethan's choice, and while she had always known that there were risks to being with someone of his power, nothing could have prepared her for the cold glares and harsh words of the court. They were not kind to her, and she could feel the sting of their judgment every time she walked through the halls. But in Ethan, she found solace. She could see the strain in his eyes, the way he carried the weight of the kingdom's expectations with him every moment of every day. He was no longer the carefree prince he once was, and she hated that she couldn't ease his burden more. But she would stand by him, no matter what. Even when the whispers became louder and the walls of the castle seemed to close in on them, Isabella remained by Ethan's side, offering him quiet support. Their bond grew stronger with every passing day, and the moments they shared, though few and far between, were the only times Ethan could truly be himself. In their private moments, the world outside seemed to disappear. It was just the two of them, together in their small, fleeting piece of peace. But it was never enough. The pressure continued to mount. Olivia, though she had accepted Ethan's decision, still carried the weight of her own emotions. She did not show her hurt openly, but Ethan could feel it. The distance between them grew wider each day. She no longer sought him out for counsel or companionship, and though she never voiced her pain, it was clear that their relationship would never be the same. Ethan longed for things to be different. He wanted to bridge the gap between them, but he knew that the rift was too deep. He had made his choice, and in doing so, he had altered the course of his family's future. But no matter how much he wished it could be different, he could not undo the past. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Ethan's resolve only strengthened. He had chosen Isabella, and despite the challenges they faced, he knew that their bond would carry them through. They would face whatever came their way together, for better or for worse. The kingdom would eventually learn to accept them, or so he hoped. But one thing was certain: Ethan would never regret the choice he had made. He had chosen love over tradition, and he would fight for it every step of the way. The tension in the castle was palpable, thickening the air with every passing day. Ethan and Isabella's bond, though strong, was being tested at every turn. The pressure from the court remained relentless, and despite their growing closeness, they could not escape the weight of tradition that loomed over them. The kingdom, once filled with excitement over the possibility of a union between the Alpha King and his sister, now stood divided. Some whispered that the Alpha King's decision was a betrayal of the royal bloodline, while others quietly supported his choice, hopeful that the future could be different. But for Ethan, every new day was a reminder that no matter how much love he felt for Isabella, there would always be a price to pay for defying centuries of tradition. Isabella, too, felt the burden of their love. She had always known that her position as an Omega came with limitations, but she had never realized how harshly the world would treat her once she was seen at the side of the Alpha King. The nobles, particularly the older members of the court, looked at her with disdain. They did not believe an Omega had the right to stand beside an Alpha, especially one as powerful as Ethan. Their judgment was sharp, their eyes cold, and Isabella could feel it every time she entered a room. It made her wish, at times, that she could disappear, that she could return to her quiet life before all of this had started. But when she looked at Ethan, when their eyes met, the world outside seemed to fade. He had chosen her, and that thought alone gave her the strength to continue. Yet, even though their bond was undeniable, their lives were far from easy. Olivia, though she had quietly accepted the situation, had not fully moved past the hurt. She was still distant, her presence in the castle like a shadow, always there but never quite part of the light. Ethan had hoped that time would heal the rift between them, but the silence between him and Olivia had only grown. There were moments when he tried to reach out to her, to ask how she was, but every conversation seemed to drift into awkwardness, the gap between them widening each time. Olivia no longer smiled at him the way she once did, and every time Ethan tried to speak with her, it felt as though he was talking to a stranger. She had given him the space to love Isabella, but in return, she had closed herself off. The kingdom, too, was divided. Ethan could feel the judgment everywhere he went, especially from the nobility. They did not speak it aloud, but it was in their eyes, their whispers, their cold shoulders. His decision had not only altered the course of his family's future, it had shaken the foundations of the kingdom. He could not escape the consequences of his actions. As weeks passed, Ethan found himself spending more time with Isabella in private. They found small moments of peace in each other's company, moments when they could forget the outside world and simply be together. They would sit in the quiet of the castle's garden, speaking softly to one another about their dreams, about a future that seemed so far out of reach. Isabella had begun to understand the weight Ethan carried. She saw the way his shoulders tensed whenever he entered a room, how he always seemed to carry the responsibility of the entire kingdom on his back. She knew that being with him, loving him, would never be easy, but she also knew that their love, despite all the challenges, was worth fighting for. The days seemed to blend together, and with each passing moment, Ethan grew more determined. He had made his choice. There was no turning back. And despite the constant challenges, despite the divided kingdom, he would stand by Isabella. He would protect her, and he would fight for their future together, no matter what it took. As the months went by, the strain on both Ethan and Isabella became increasingly evident. Though their bond had grown stronger, the kingdom was still not ready to accept them as a couple. Whispers continued to spread throughout the court, with many nobles expressing their disapproval of the Alpha King's choice. The pressure was relentless, and the weight of their decision weighed heavily on both of them. Isabella could feel it every time she entered a room. The cold stares, the hushed conversations, and the subtle gestures that made her feel like an outsider were constant reminders that she was not fully accepted. She had never asked for the spotlight, and yet now she was at the center of it, forced to navigate a world that viewed her as lesser simply because of her status as an Omega. At times, she wished she could vanish into the background, but when she looked at Ethan, she knew she could not. She had chosen to stand by him, and she would continue to do so, no matter the cost. Ethan, too, felt the pressure. He had chosen Isabella, and while he had no regrets, he knew the kingdom would never view their relationship with the same acceptance as they would a traditional royal union. His decision had shaken the very foundation of the kingdom, and every move he made was scrutinized. He could no longer be the carefree leader he once was. Now, he was expected to carry the burden of his choice, not just for himself, but for his entire kingdom. He longed for the days when life was simpler, before he had to make such difficult decisions. But those days were long gone. Even as the pressure mounted, Ethan and Isabella found solace in each other. Their private moments were the only times they could escape the harsh realities of the world around them. In the quiet of the castle's gardens, or within the walls of their private chambers, they could be themselves. There, they were not the Alpha King and his Omega, but two people who had found something beautiful and rare in each other. It was in these moments that Ethan realized just how much he had come to rely on Isabella. She was his anchor in the storm, the one person who made him feel like he wasn't alone in the world. She was not just his partner, she was his equal, and he would fight for her every step of the way. But the challenges continued. Olivia, though she had not openly protested Ethan's decision, had distanced herself further. She remained a part of the court, but she no longer shared the same warmth with Ethan that she once had. Their conversations had become strained, and though she never expressed her hurt outright, Ethan could feel it every time they spoke. It was as though a wall had been built between them, one that neither of them knew how to break down. He missed his sister more than he cared to admit. She had been his closest confidant, the one person he could always rely on. But now, he wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between them. Olivia's acceptance of his decision had been quiet, but it was clear that something had changed. The kingdom, too, had begun to show signs of strain. The nobles, once eager to align themselves with the royal family, were now hesitant, unsure of where they stood in the wake of Ethan's controversial choice. Some whispered of rebellion, while others quietly accepted the new reality. But no matter the challenges, Ethan knew he could not turn back. He had made his choice, and he would stand by it, even if it meant facing the wrath of those who could not understand. He had chosen Isabella, and though the road ahead was uncertain, he would walk it with her by his side. Together, they would face whatever came their way, and he would do whatever it took to protect her and their future. The days grew colder as winter approached, and with it came the sense of inevitability. Ethan could feel it in the air, the growing tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the castle. Despite his firm resolve, there were moments when even he couldn't escape the weight of his choices. His family was fractured, his kingdom divided, and the woman he loved, Isabella, stood by him. But even she could not escape the stares, the whispers, the judgment. The court had begun to show signs of unrest. The nobles who had once supported him now whispered amongst themselves, unsure whether to follow his lead or remain loyal to tradition. Some of the older lords had openly questioned his decision, calling it reckless, and others spoke of how the kingdom would never be the same without a union that followed the old ways. Ethan had never been one to back down from a challenge, but as he walked through the castle halls, he could feel the coldness in the air. Every glance from a noble or even a servant was laden with judgment. His every action was being watched. Isabella, on the other hand, seemed to be retreating further into herself. Despite the quiet strength she had shown since the beginning, the weight of the kingdom's scorn was beginning to take its toll on her. She tried to put on a brave face, to smile when Ethan needed her to, but behind her eyes, there was a weariness that he couldn't ignore. He hated that she had to endure this, that their love had to be tested so publicly. He longed for the days when they could simply be together without the eyes of the world on them. But those days were gone. Every moment was a reminder of the path he had chosen. They had no choice but to continue forward. Olivia, still a part of the court, had become more distant with each passing day. Ethan could feel the rift growing, even as she kept a polite facade. They spoke less and less, and when they did, the words felt hollow, devoid of the warmth they once shared. Olivia never openly voiced her hurt, but it was in the way she looked at him now, the way her smile no longer reached her eyes. She had made her peace with his choice, but the cost had been high, and Ethan knew it. He longed to fix things between them, but he also knew that there was no easy solution. The damage had been done. The fracture was too deep. As the weeks wore on, Ethan found himself questioning whether he had done the right thing. He had followed his heart, but at what cost? His kingdom was unsettled, his sister was drifting further away, and Isabella, though loyal, was slowly becoming a symbol of defiance, of change that many were not ready to accept. But in the quiet moments when he and Isabella were alone, the world seemed to melt away. In those brief moments, they found a peace that neither of them could find anywhere else. Isabella, always so quiet and thoughtful, had grown stronger in her own right. She had become a silent pillar for him, standing by his side without complaint. She never asked for the kingdom's approval, never sought the accolades or recognition that so many others did. All she wanted was to be with him, to build a future where they could both live in peace. It was a simple dream, but in a world that valued tradition above all else, it felt impossible. Yet, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that their love, though unconventional, was something worth fighting for. He had chosen her, and no matter the obstacles in their way, he would continue to choose her. The road ahead was uncertain, and the kingdom would never fully accept their union. But as long as they had each other, Ethan knew they could face whatever came next. Together, they would fight for their future, no matter what the cost. As winter deepened, so did the divide within the kingdom. Ethan could no longer ignore the growing discontent that simmered beneath the surface. Every move he made was now closely observed, and his once proud court now buzzed with silent whispers. The nobles, many of whom had once been his allies, were no longer so supportive. They saw his decision to marry Isabella, a woman considered beneath his station by many, as a betrayal of the royal bloodline, a dangerous move that could weaken the kingdom. Yet, in the midst of all the unrest, Ethan remained resolute. He had made his choice, and though it was not easy, he would not let the pressures of the court change that. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew he had to continue forward with Isabella by his side. Isabella, for her part, had become more than just his partner. She had become his strength in moments of doubt. Despite the weight of the kingdom's judgment, she stood firm with him, offering him silent support. She never asked for anything more than his love, and in return, she gave him everything she had. Every day, she quietly shouldered the burden of their relationship, enduring the glares and cold shoulders of the court. It was not easy, but she did it for him, and for the love they had built together. Ethan had never expected the journey to be easy, but seeing the toll it was taking on Isabella hurt him more than he cared to admit. She was the one person who had never wavered in her loyalty, yet the world around her seemed to crumble. Every time she smiled, it was as if she were hiding the pain beneath her eyes. He hated the fact that she had to endure this, but there was nothing he could do to make it better. Olivia, on the other hand, had become more withdrawn. She no longer visited Ethan in private, and when they did speak, their conversations felt strained. The bond they had shared growing up seemed to have been severed, and though Ethan tried to reach out to her, she always held him at arm's length. The distance between them had grown so much that even the thought of repairing their relationship seemed impossible. Olivia had quietly accepted his decision, but she had not forgiven him for it. Ethan could feel her pain, though she never showed it outright. It was in the silence that had replaced their once easy camaraderie, in the coldness of her demeanor. The kingdom itself was changing. The people were watching, waiting for the moment when the decision would either prove to be the king's greatest triumph or his downfall. Ethan couldn't help but wonder what would become of his reign if the nobility continued to oppose him. The stakes were higher now, and the pressure of ruling a kingdom while holding on to his love for Isabella was a burden he wasn't sure how much longer he could bear. But in the quiet moments they shared, he found solace. Isabella, despite the growing animosity around them, was still the one person he could trust completely. She had never expected anything more than his heart, and in return, she gave him hers. And that was enough. As the winter months stretched on, Ethan knew the battle was far from over. He had made a decision that would change the course of history, and now, he had to fight for it. He had chosen Isabella, and no matter the cost, no matter the challenges that lay ahead, he would stand by her. Together, they would face whatever came their way, and they would carve out a future, a life, that was theirs and theirs alone.